All right, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. We want to begin our study in Matthew 26. We're looking at the life of Christ, in particular that last 6 months of the Lord's work on the earth, and we are on the precipice of his arrest in the garden, that last night before he will be taken and tried and crucified. And so we start in Matthew 26 tonight, and we begin with the first verse. It came to pass that when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days it is the feast of the Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." We've been leading up to this last Passover. The Lord has been in situations where he's been threatened by his enemies, and he's chosen to escape those circumstances because the time was not yet. But the time has come. And as we pointed out before, how appropriate. It was the Lord's plan that at the Passover, that his Son would be offered for the world. The Passover feast, going back 1,400 years from the time that we're reading about here, was a picture of people being saved from death by the blood of a lamb. And so the Lamb of God that takes away the sin of the world is ready to offer himself. So it's in this circumstance that Jesus again tells the disciples about his being betrayed and crucified. He has made this point before and more plainly as the time is drawn closer. But it's obvious that these men just simply cannot understand this plain language. They hear what he's saying, but to them the idea of Jesus, who could walk on the water and feed 5,000 with 5 loaves and a few fish, you think that some man's going to be able to take him and arrest him and crucify him? Who would betray him? No, there's no way that can happen. But that's exactly what would happen. And it was all a part of the Lord's plan. Anyway, back to verse 3. "And they assembled together the chief priests and the scribes and the elders of the people unto the palace of the high priest, who is called Caiaphas, and consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him." They were looking for some way by craft, by deception, dishonesty, to grab Jesus away from the crowds. They were scared to try to arrest Jesus in broad daylight because they knew the support that Jesus had, at least among many in Jerusalem. So they were cowardly, in a weasel fashion. They were looking to try to sneak something over. But the Lord would use even their craft in order to work his purpose and to ultimately condemn these enemies. "Not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people." We want him all right, but we don't dare do this in broad daylight in the middle of Passover. We're afraid these folks will turn on us. So this evil, cowardly heart. But they're looking for some way, and that'll come in handy here. The next story that we find is this one. Verse 6, Matthew tells, "Now when Jesus was in Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, there came unto him a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat. When his disciples saw it, they had indignation, saying, 'To what purpose is this waste?'" Let me pause a minute. What waste you talking about? This good work done on the Son of God? That the waste you're talking about? Is it a waste to offer to God? "This ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor." Putting a pretty face on a rather ugly thought. But when Jesus understood it, he said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she hath wrought a good work on me. For ye have the poor with you always, but me ye have not always. For in that she hath poured this ointment on my body, she did it for my burial. Verily I say to you, wheresoever the gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this that the woman has done be told for a memorial of her." And so we still do. Every time we read this story, we remember her. Now, actually, if you look at the other gospel accounts, we find more detail here. we find this woman is no less than Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. We also find out that while the disciples showed indignation, the real objection came from and was stirred by no less than Judas. We also find out that whereas Matthew and Mark put this story immediately preceding the betrayal or the contract between Judas and the enemies of Jesus, actually took place several days earlier. In chronology, this story took place a week before the Lord was betrayed, but we find the other gospel writers tying it immediately to the betrayal of Jesus. And I think the reason for that, I believe, is at least because this was sort of in Judas' mind the final straw. We learn also from, I think, John's account that the real reason why Judas objected to this expensive gift being given to Jesus rather than being converted to money is because Judas was the man who kept the bag. And he had been stealing, embezzling money for some time. I'm not sure how long, but certainly Judas had been planning to quit the group, to leave. He was putting aside some money to sort of make that passage more easy. And he thought to himself, man, I could have used that money. I could have taken that money. Instead, we've wasted it on Jesus. Claiming it to be a concern about the poor. You know, so many times people try to conceal evil motives with pretty words and professions. And here's an example of that. Nothing new about that. Human beings do that quite a bit. But the Lord has called him out on that. Not all the way. He hasn't yet revealed that Judas is a thief, and certainly that he's going to be the betrayer. But he simply says that you are wrong to rebuke this woman, that she's done right and you're wrong. And that seems to have hurt Judas's pride. Because the very next story we find, which I do think is related intentionally, is that Judas marches with this sting in mind over to the enemies of Jesus. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said to them, "What will you give me that I deliver him to you?" Well, boy, that was convenient, wasn't it? They were looking for a way to arrest Jesus, and Judas, one of his disciples, he'll know where he is. He'll know a time when he'll be away from the crowds. He'll know where Jesus is staying, and this will be perfect. So Judas comes to them, and they covenant with him for 30 pieces of silver. Judas is bargaining. What will you give me? And these fellows drive a pretty hard bargain. You know, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, how Judas, a Jew who grew up certainly hearing the law read in the synagogues, how could he have missed that passage over in Zechariah 11, I think it is, where the prophet talks about the price being paid of 30 pieces of silver and the Christ being betrayed. You know, how did that not ring a bell in his head when that number came up? Which, by the way, it's a very humble number. 30 pieces of silver. I'm not sure exactly how to convert that into modern money. People do offer their thoughts. One marginal note that I read suggested that we're talking about roughly $50 in modern money. I don't know if that's true or not. We could double that or half it. I don't know, but let's just use that as an example. You're going to sell out the Son of God for $50? You're going to sell your soul for $50? Well, that was the price they came to. Over in Exodus, I think it's the 21st chapter, there's a reference there. One of the precepts of the law of Moses said that you have a servant, and someone's animal gores your servant, wounds your servant. Then that fellow was obligated to destroy the animal that had wounded and to pay you 30 pieces of silver. So that tells you something. Even if we're not sure about all the conversions, it's just the price of a wounded slave for his trouble and for the master's sake. His trouble. It's a small amount of money, but it sort of tells you something about where Judas is as well. I'll offer this, not that it makes anything better, But as we said a moment ago, I don't think for a moment that Judas believed that the enemies of Jesus could do him any real harm. Maybe that's how he solaced his conscience, if he had a conscience. He would have said to himself, well, look, I'm leaving, and I'm going to get what I can out of this. And he didn't like me saying that about that money that was spent on him. So I'm going to get this money, even if it's $50. I'm going to get it. And I know that his enemies won't be able to do anything with him anyway, because I've seen him get out of all these troubles and problems, and I'm just sure he'll get out of this too. And but it won't be my problem anymore. I'll take my money and I'm going to go start a new life. And we don't know exactly what he was thinking, but I feel confident it was somewhere along that line. And so he thought, well, I'm going to earn this $50. Now, from that time on, he sought an opportunity to betray him and to become maybe the most infamous man that's ever lived. When we think about Judas, when we hear that name, we think about the ultimate betrayal. It was said by the Lord that woe to that man, it'd been better for him not to have been born than to be the betrayer. But this is the path that Judas has taken. Okay. Look in verse 17. Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, Where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? Let me pause again for just a moment. When you think about the Passover being one of the three great occasions in which Israel would come together and meet together at the temple in the spring of the year, in this case, there'd be just thousands upon thousands of visitors. Of course, Jerusalem had a significant Jewish population, but Jews from far and wide would, as opportunity afforded, come to Jerusalem for the Passover. And you might have had maybe 1 million people in this city. It was a fantastic crowd that would have been there on any given Passover. And to that point, what we find Jesus suggesting is we're going to need the hospitality of someone here. Verse 18, he said, Go into the city to such a man and say to him, The Master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. And so here a room is provided, and provisions are made. This was hospitality in its truest sense. We use that term, I guess, in different ways, but the Greek term for hospitality literally means love of strangers. And so here they were going to be willing and ready to provide space for their Jewish brethren who had come from somewhere else in order to eat the Passover. And that would be the circumstance of Jesus and his disciples. Well, when even was come, here we are at evening, and he sat down with the 12. Now, let's turn over to the book of John, if we might, just a moment, and pick up a detail or two. We're looking mainly at Matthew. But in John chapter 13, we do find a little bit more about this last great Passover. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them to the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things to his hand, and that he was come from the Father and come from God and went to God, he rises from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Let me pause there again. In reading the four accounts, we learn that the disciples had an ongoing argument about who was the greatest. And as the point's been made before, you can be sure of this, that argument did not go this way. Oh, I think you're the greatest. No, I won't hear. You're the greatest. No, you're the greatest. That's not the way that argument went. It suggested a spirit of pride, of being uplifted in an evil way, of jealousy, and so on. The Lord had addressed that problem several times with the disciples. And by the way, we can beat up on these guys, and there's nothing commendable about this. What they don't realize, I think, fully is that here they are, and the Lord is just at the precipice of offering himself for the sins of the world, and we're over here arguing about whether I'm better than you or you. That's just terrible. It's terrible any time. It's especially terrible at this moment. But the Lord had tried a number of ways to bring the disciples around. Now, I started to say, before we get too hard on those folks, we ought to think about the problem of pride in our own lives, because it is a problem. And in so many cases, if we were honest with ourselves, we'd recognize in the things that we say and do a good bit of that spirit of pride, of looking down at somebody else, thinking too much of ourselves. I've made this confession before, but I remember an occasion a number of years ago in which, after a conversation, and it doesn't matter about the circumstances, in which I thought that someone was rude to me and disrespectful to me, I found myself not only the next day, but several days later, weeks later, still sort of stinging about that. And it was a good reminder to me when it finally dawned on me. You wouldn't have thought 2 seconds about that if you weren't a proud person. You've got a problem. So this is a human problem. It's ugly. It is, Paul would call it later, the condemnation of the devil. This is a devilish spirit, but it's one that human beings struggle with. So when we see this problem in these folks, we ought to recognize it in ourselves as well, and the danger of it. Be that as it may. We have here the story of the Lord this time trying to teach them about humility and true greatness by girding himself with a towel. Apparently, there had been much provided for this Passover, but not a servant to wash their feet. And so the Lord said, I'll take that job. And so he washes the feet of the disciples, Andrew, James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew. And then he comes to Peter. You can imagine how they all must have felt. But Peter's the one who speaks up and says, not me. You're not going to wash my feet. Great men don't wash the feet. This is a menial job. And one day when I'm a great man, I'm not going to be stooping like this to serve in this way. And that was the very point the Lord was trying to make with him. Peter, you don't understand what real greatness is. Real greatness is not measured in pride and pomp. It's measured in how you serve another. Then he comes to Peter, verse 6. Peter said to him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Incredulous, disbelieving. You think you're going to do this? Jesus said to him, what I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. He said, you'll never wash my feet. To which Jesus responded, if I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. And Simon Peter saith unto him, well then, Lord, don't wash my feet only, but my hands and my head. And Jesus said, no, you've misunderstood. He said, in effect, just what's dirty needs to be washed. And you're clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him. Therefore he said, ye are not all clean. That sort of implies that Judas might have been among the number of those that Jesus whose feet Jesus had washed. So after he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and was set down again, he said to them, know ye what I have done to you? Do you understand? You call me Master and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If then I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say to you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them. the Lord was not setting up some sort of an empty ritual, foot washing, as some have misunderstood it. But what he was teaching is a very practical lesson, and that is that as a servant of God, there's no service too menial, no honest and needed service too menial for you to do. If you understand what greatness is, you understand that it's shown in serving. And the Lord is the example of that. He came not to be ministered to, but to minister, and to give his life, offer his life a ransom for many. It is a powerful lesson, and it still speaks to us through the years. Well, back to Matthew 26 now. And this time we're looking at verse 21. And as they did eat, and I believe what they're eating at this point in Matthew is still the Passover, he said, "Verily I say to you, one of you shall betray me." Let me pause there. Try to imagine, if you will, the explosion that statement must have seemed like. You're telling me that one of us, just looking around the room, it's just them in the room there, one of us is going to betray you? One of us is for your enemies. One of us is going to turn on you. One of us. They were exceedingly sorrowful, verse 22. One of them said to him, "Lord, is it I?" Everyone began to say to him, "Lord, is it I?" I think the import of that statement is, again, more disbelief. Some of the modern speech translations, I think, translated it something like, "Lord, you don't mean me, do you? Not me. Surely not me." And the Lord said, "He that dips his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me." Jesus gave them a sign. Other accounts tell us that John asked him, "Which one is it?" And Jesus said, "Well, he that I give the sop to is the one." And that word sop seems to indicate the idea of something of a piece of bread that's been dipped in a gravy or some sort of thing. And then in a very familiar way, in a very family atmosphere, you talk about somebody passing the bread. Well, in this case, they're passing the bread that's been dipped. Jesus had told John, and some understood this to be so, that it's the one that I give the sop to. But apparently when it happened, nobody noticed or made the connection. Now Jesus went on to say, as we mentioned a moment ago, "The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born." And Judas, not to be left out, he had to ask the same question. "Oh, Lord, Master, is it I?" He said to him, "You know who it is." Well, let me go back to John 13 just a moment. When Jesus had thus said, he was troubled in spirit and testified, saying, "Verily, verily, I say to you, one of you shall betray me." And the disciples looked at one another, doubting of whom he spake. Let me just pause there. That's interesting too, isn't it? That when Jesus brought up this matter, that somebody, one of you 12, is a traitor, they didn't all point and say, "Oh yeah, Judas. I know, Judas, we're watching you. We know it's you." Judas by this time was stealing from the bag. He had made up his mind to leave. He'd already made his bargain. So his heart was far away. But isn't it interesting how that even in this tight-knit fellowship, the other 11 disciples seem to have no idea or clue that Judas is the betrayer, that they were as shocked as they could be when the story finally came out, and it always does. But that's an interesting point. I think maybe one we can relate to. Through the years, we might see people who make decisions and turn away from God, and you just think, "I can't believe they did that." But as one fellow put it, very seldom is a soul lost by a blowout. We put it in terms of a tire. It's usually a slow leak, or or another figure, when you see a storm go through an area and you see some big tree that falls to the ground or is broken in half, when you begin to examine that tree, you'll find that there was a lot of rot in it to begin with. And there's been a lot of rot in Judas for some time. I don't know how long. But the disciples don't see it at this point. And they are wondering. This is the story we mentioned a moment ago where the one leaning on Jesus' bosom, which seems to be a statement of humility on John's part. He's saying, I'm one of the disciples that was loved by Jesus. And I asked him who. Peter wanted to know who. And so Jesus tells them, the one I give the sop to, that's the one. And so he gave it to Simon, to Judas Iscariot, Simon's son. And after the sop, Satan entered into him. And then said Jesus unto him, What thou doest, do quickly. And again, now no man at the table knew for what intent he had spake this unto him. For some of them thought, because Judas had the bag, that Jesus had said unto him, Buy those things that we have need of against the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. But even to this point, Judas's treachery is hidden, but not to Jesus. And so then, having received the sop, he went immediately out, and it was night. It's a little difficult to know in reading the accounts exactly at what point in the proceedings Judas left. I think you can make a case from this passage that it was before the Lord instituted the Lord's Supper, as we call it. They'd been eating the Passover. Judas had been given this piece of bread, and immediately he left. And then afterward, the Lord took emblems from the table, unleavened bread and the fruit of the grapevine, to institute what we know as the Lord's Supper, something that would continue to be observed in the kingdom that was at hand. Judas now is gone. He's made his bargain. He knows now where they're going to be in a short time. And so he's going to go find those that have paid him and gather up some soldiers and meet them there at the place where Jesus will resort that night. The Lord knows all of this. But his mind is on those disciples that are left, those that are faithful. And he wants to say and do things that will strengthen them and help them and instruct them as the time is growing short. So back to Matthew 26. As they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. This is not the Passover. The unleavened bread in the Passover represented the hurried nature of the escape from Egypt because of the destruction that God would bring. But here, the unleavened bread represents the body of Christ. That vessel that Jesus took upon himself, that he lived in, that he obeyed God in, that he suffered in, and that he offered as a sacrifice for us, for our sins. The perfect, flawless, blameless Lamb of God. Jesus also took a second emblem. He took the cup and gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, Drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Again, notice that language. If we had the time, we might go back over to Exodus, I think it's the 24th chapter, when the old covenant, the first covenant, the covenant of Moses was ratified. You remember how that God had given the law at Mount Sinai, how that the people were gathered together before Moses, sacrifices were offered, the blood was kept, part of that blood was sprinkled upon the altar, and part of that blood was sprinkled upon the people. They read the book of the law. Here is what God expects of you. And Moses, in sprinkling that blood upon the people, he said, Behold, the blood of the covenant, which the Lord hath made with you concerning these words. There was an implied promise there that as the Lord has said, so must you do. He's ratifying that old covenant. Now, in this case, we find a new covenant, a New Testament. This is not just a testament for the Jews, but for all people. We are obligated to serve God. The blood has been shed. We find His body has been given. And this supper represents a promise made, as well as an occasion to give thanks to God for the greatest sacrifice ever given. Jesus said, I'll not drink it henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. The kingdom there, I think, represents the church that would be established shortly. It would be a part of the worship of the New Testament church, the kingdom. And you can read in the New Testament about its implementation, about some abuses of the supper and regulation of the supper. But the Lord's Supper, we still observe this simple but beautiful and appropriate, authorized way to remember the sacrifice of Jesus, His body, His blood. Now, verse 30 says that when they had sung a hymn, it's interesting to me, this will sneak up on you. You can read references to music in worship and scattered throughout. And here on this occasion, this very somber occasion, this night in which the Lord's Supper is instituted, the night in which Jesus will be betrayed, He takes the time to sing a hymn with the disciples. And they go out toward the Mount of Olives. They've been in this upper room in the city, and now they're going to be making their way from Jerusalem, the heights, down the hill of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, where there is a creek that runs there, did at that time. And then back up the other side, on the east side of Jerusalem, is this place known as the Mount of Olives. They're heading toward a particular place. But I might just make this point in passing, and I'm sure it's something you probably noticed. But if you turn over to the Gospel of John again, and you look at John, the 14th chapter, in verse 31, the last verse of John 14 reads, "Arise, let us go hence." And what you find next are some very familiar words in John 15 and John 16. These are lessons that are taught, and it seems to be that the setting of these lessons is during this journey from the hill in Jerusalem in the darkness, making their way down into the valley and then back up, or at least to the Kidron, Brook Kidron. I am the vine, and ye are the branches. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine, no more can ye abide in me. Except ye abide in me, I should say. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abides in me, and I in him, the same brings forth much fruit. Without me you can do nothing. A powerful lesson, a great figure, a great sermon, spoken to his disciples as they were making their way in the darkness down the hill. Remember the word that I've spoken to you, John 15:20. The servant is not greater than his Lord. If they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. I don't think they had any idea how much they needed to hear those words or how soon they would be put to the test. But the Lord knows, just hours now before the events in the garden, before the Lord would be crucified, before the world of the disciples would be turned upside down. And He tells them along the way about the Comforter, the Paracletus, the Comforter who would come. The Father will send in my name. I go away, but I'll not leave you comfortless. The Comforter will come. He will guide you into all truth, He promises in chapter 16. So it's a powerful story. And then in chapter 17, Jesus prays a familiar prayer. This is rightly called, I think, the Lord's Prayer, in which He prays for Himself. Father, glorify Thou me with Thine own self with the glory that I had with Thee before the world was. He prays for His disciples, those that the Father has given Him. And He says, sanctify them through Thy truth. Thy word is truth. And then he says, you remember, I don't pray just for these alone, but for all that shall believe on me through their word, that they may all be one. All of us who have obeyed God, come to God through the word of the apostles. He prayed for us as well, that they might be one as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. And then chapter 18 begins with these words, when Jesus had spoken these things, he went forth with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, to which he entered in and his disciples. So it's a powerful picture. We go back now to the Gospel of Matthew, and we continue this journey as the Lord has made his way now into up the Mount of Olives and to a place known as Gethsemane. In verse 31 of Matthew 26, Jesus said to them, all ye shall be offended because of me this night. It is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered abroad. But after I'm risen again, I go before you to Galilee. And this is where you remember Peter is not willing to concede the point. He said, no, not me. You're talking about people being offended. They're going to leave you. They're going to let you down. Not me. Though all men forsake you, I'll never be offended. That's where Jesus, you remember, told him, he said, verily I say to you, this night before the rooster crows twice in the morning. It was already quite late. So just in a short time from now, you're going to deny me publicly that you even know me 3 times. And Peter said, I'll die with you. I'll give my life for you. I'd never do that. And the disciples all said the same thing, But Jesus and the disciples come to this place, Gethsemane. And Gethsemane means oil press, by the way. It must have been a place where there were olive trees, and olives were converted into the oil. And so, but the thing that's significant about this place to us is this is a place that Jesus and his disciples knew well. It's a place where Jesus would go when maybe it was a place to find some quiet, to find some peace, maybe late at night or early in the morning. It was a place where he would go to pray. And on this occasion, the same is going on. He tells the disciples, there are 11 of them with him now. He tells 8 of them, you stay here while I go and pray yonder. And he takes 3 of the disciples, Peter and the sons of Zebedee, James and John. I don't know why these 3. He doesn't tell us why. Maybe they were a little deeper, a little more advanced, a little more mature. I don't know exactly. But he took them to be a special comfort. And Jesus began to be sorrowful and very heavy, Matthew says. And he saith unto them, the 3, he says, my soul is exceeding sorrowful even to death. Tarry ye here and watch with me. And then he went a little bit further. And he fell on his face and he prayed and he said, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. A lot of questions have been raised about what Jesus meant here. I think maybe the simplest answer is the best. I don't think the Lord for a moment forgot why he came to earth. But this is a very human, I think, prayer in which maybe all of us at one point or another have faced something that we knew we had to go through but was unpleasant, and we've just said, Lord, if there's any way, let this pass from me. But let your will be done. Let your will be done. And that was the case of Jesus. He prayed this earnest, heartfelt prayer with the sweat dropping like great drops of blood. And then he came back to the disciples, his comforters, and he found them asleep. They were sleeping for sorrow, one of the inspired writers tells us, but the Lord didn't give them any slack. He said, Peter, calls him out particularly, you going to die with me, but you can't watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Still a good point for us to remember. And so he goes again the second time, and he prays similar thought. O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. And he came and found them asleep again. Their eyes were heavy. He left them and he went away and prayed the third time, saying the same words. He knew all too well what he was facing. And then he comes to his disciples and he says, "Sleep on now and take your rest. Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. He is at hand that doth betray me." And what happens next, of course, Matthew says that while he yet spake, coming up the hill is a mob of soldiers under the authority of the chief priest. These temple police and borrowed Roman soldiers are coming up the hill, and led by Judas. And Judas had made his agreement. It's dark out here, and there are going to be several fellows in their crew. But don't worry, you won't be confused about who it is that's Jesus. I'll go up to him, and I'll kiss him with a kiss of greeting, and that'll be the one. That'll be the sign. Take that one. So he does. He comes to Jesus. Matthew doesn't tell us, but I think it's John who points out how that actually, while they came up, they were their mob and their swords and their weapons. When Jesus came forth and asked them, "Who are you looking for?" and they said, "Jesus of Nazareth," they all fell backwards. They maybe expected him to run or to hide. He didn't run, he didn't hide, and they were afraid. But Judas has got to earn his $50, So he comes forward, and he identifies Jesus, and they come to arrest him. And when they do, that's when one of them, we know it from other accounts to be Peter, stretched out his hand and drew his sword. Another account tells us that they had a couple of swords with them. I don't know what they had those swords for. I don't think it was to fight off the Roman army. That'd be sort of foolish. It was foolish here. He drew his sword and struck at a servant. Actually, another account tells us his name was Malchus. He was the servant of the high priest, and smote off his ear. Not, I'm sure, intending to strike off his ear, maybe trying to cut his head off. But Jesus is horrified. He's horrified at Peter. Not these men that have come to arrest him, not even Judas, but Peter. He said, "Put up your sword. All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." You think I need your help, Peter? You think that I couldn't now call on my Father and he would presently send me 12 legions of angels? But how would the scripture be fulfilled? This must be. And so, in that same hour, verse 55, Jesus said to the multitudes, he said, "Are you come out against a thief with swords and staves to take me? I daily was with you teaching in the temple. You laid no hands on me. But all this is done that the scriptures might be fulfilled." As one of the accounts quotes the Lord as saying, "This is your hour, the hour of darkness." It must have been very late at night or very early in the morning, before dawn, depending on how you look at it. And it was then that all the disciples forsook him, and they all fled. Powerful story. We'll plan to pick up next time with the story of the trials of Jesus, of his crucifixion, and then eventually of his resurrection, and his appearances and words of encouragement leading ultimately to his ascension. So thank you again for taking part in this. We appreciate your interest, and we do hope that you will join us again next time as we study and conclude our study of the life of Christ. Thank you very much.